Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise too with an enduring concern in interest to protect women from the most abhorrent crimes, as Senator Hanson-Young has referred to, rise to speak on this bill, the Crimes Legislation Amendment, Slavery, Slavery-like Conditions and People Trafficking Bill 2012. And as my colleague Senator Brandis has noted earlier on in this debate, most of the offences described as new by the government are in essence definitional changes to existing offences in the criminal code. However, there are important new offences in organ trafficking and forced marriage, and it is the latter, the establishment of two new offences related to forced marriage, that I will confine my remarks to, largely because of my involvement in the inquiry which has been alluded to. In saying that, though, I would just like to briefly mention that I support the strengthening of regulations against organ trafficking. I don't think there is anyone in Australia that would consider it to be anything but a heinous crime, but we have to recognise and be cognizant of the fact that this is an emerging and flourishing commercial trade that happens overseas and is continuing and happens today as we stand here to legislate against it. So this is a good move in the sense that it does strengthen our position on it, legislating against it to make sure that we do stamp out all possibility of this happening in Australia and for people overseas to abuse the legislative program and framework here in Australia. As I said, I support my colleagues' comments on the bill before me, and in particular the concerns that they have raised, such as the ambiguously wide definition of servitude that could be misused in an industrial relations context. As always, on this side of the chamber, we give the utmost care and consideration to ensuring that legislation that comes before us in this place does not lead to unintended consequences for our community. And I call on the Gillard government to support our proposed amendments. Madam Acting Deputy President, I will now focus the remainder of my comments today on forced marriage and the relevant offences in this bill that the bill addresses. It was just over a year ago that, confronting media reports and stories from the community about young women being brought to Australia to be forced into marriage, led me to co-author with Senator Cash an inquiry into this issue. While that inquiry looked at all aspects of prospective marriage visas, many of the submissions contained evidence and commentary relating to the incidence of forced marriage in this country, and we heard from many witnesses who came forward about their concerns in this regard. The definition this bill inserts into the Criminal Code defines forced marriage as one, and I quote, where, because of coercion, threat or deception, a person, the victim, entered into the marriage without freely and fully consenting. And I end the quote there. It is inconceivable to many of us the notion that any person, any woman, could be forced into entering a marriage against her will. It, as we understand, is a cultural and, in some countries, a religious practice, a tradition where marriages are arranged between two parties. But I note that here in Australia, that's not how we do things. And marriage is one of probably the biggest decisions that any two individuals will make in their life. It is one of the greatest commitments that any two individuals can make between themselves, and so it should be. And so anything that actually contravenes that, I strongly oppose, and am particularly concerned that individuals may be forced into marriages here in Australia when it's certainly not our tradition and it's not the Australian way of life. But unfortunately, I have to say, the anecdotal evidence reveals there is a hidden and a disturbing problem here in this country. It may not be a huge problem. That is something that is very hard to identify, and Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has just spoken to the lack of anecdotal evidence that we have here, but there is certainly evidence that this is a disturbing problem here. There are reported cases of so-called marriage trafficking, where women are brought to Australia and forced into marriage, as well as the reverse situation where women are taken overseas for the very same purpose. It is impossible for me to forget the widely reported plight of a 17-year-old Sydney girl who managed to save herself from a forced marriage in Lebanon with the help of the Australian Federal Police. There are also alarming accounts of women living in Australia being similarly forced into marriage here, particularly in the migrant community. As I mentioned earlier, the difficulty that we have is this evidence is anecdotal. The incidence of forced marriages in this country is an unknown factor. As Dr Thomason, Director of the Criminal Institute of Australia, made clear in the recent prospective marriage visa classes inquiry, research into human trafficking, and in particular the connection between marriage and human trafficking, is in an infancy stage. So in other words, there is no and has been extremely little, if any, research undertaken to ascertain the significance of this in Australia. The CIA does intend to further examine these connections, and I wish them all the best in that critical work. There is no doubt that as the CIA, as well as the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women in Australia, have argued, there is a need for greater research into and awareness of the issue of forced marriage. In this respect, we can look to the United Kingdom, where this issue has been given significant attention and focus, with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office even establishing a forced marriage unit 2005. This unit has a policy role in working with the other government departments and community organisations to tackle the issue, and has been responsible for, among other things, publishing guidelines to help frontline workers identify and deal with cases of forced marriage. It has been recommended to this government that it consider establishing a working group to investigate the incidence of forced marriages in Australia and to explore relevant options that can be provided to assist victims. I strongly call on the government to act on this recommendation, which goes hand in hand with the legislation that we have before us today. It is also imperative that we seize the opportunity to put the spotlight on this issue to protect current and future victims. We need more research into exactly how prevalent forced marriages are. We need to raise awareness of the problem in the community, and we need to provide more information and support to the women who tragically find themselves the victim of this heinous practice. We also need to, as the prospective marriage visa classes inquiry recommended, raise the minimum age of visa holders within the prospective marriage visa program to 18 years of age to help minimise the incidence of forced marriage and human trafficking in Australia. The current visa requirements allow for young women under the age of 17 to be brought to this country for 9 months, be sponsored by someone here in Australia, and come here under the age of 18 with the intention of them being married at the age of 18. We believe the inquiry heard much evidence in relation to this, but we did determine that that was too young, that girls under the age of 18 were particularly exposed and would potentially not be provided the proper protection and afforded the rights that they should be, that it was a fragile age, and that is one immediate change that could be made to strengthen our position in relation to forced marriages. And now this moment in time is when we need to do all this. We can afford to wait a moment longer, because if we do, another young woman can find herself trapped in a situation of not her own making. I welcome the creation of 2 forced marriage offences in this bill. The Criminal Code does not currently explicitly criminalise the act of causing a person to enter into a forced marriage, but with this bill it will become illegal to both cause a person to enter into a forced marriage and to be a party to a forced marriage. The second offence is directed at the spouse, who is not a victim of forced marriage. Some critics have raised concerns about criminalising forced marriage and the potential for victims to be deterred from reporting for fear of the court process and being ostracised. And this is another issue that was raised during the inquiry that I will come to shortly, that I have serious concerns about. I agree with the majority of organisations, including the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, that work in this field needs to support criminalisation. We need to make absolutely clear that Australia condemns this practice of forcing women into marriage, and that under no circumstances do we support it. Ours is a country where people are free to choose whom they marry, and so must it remain. I also believe that including these offences in the Criminal Code will help to raise awareness of the problem, so a problem that often remains hidden but once again exists. The Coalition does have concerns, however, as to the strict liability imposed in the forced marriage offences. There is a reversal of the onus of proof, so that if the prosecution establishes a person was forced into a marriage, the other party to the marriage is presumed guilty and must establish a lawful excuse. If I could just reflect on a couple of issues that came out of the inquiry and that other senators have raised in their debate on these particular bills, and that is firstly the need for a central register. Through the inquiry, we established that there is no one agency that is responsible for collating any information on this. If the police are advised of a matter, if it's the Department of Community Affairs, if it's the Immigration Office, there is no one central agency that are advised of the incidents or the concerns expressed that an individual may be in a forced marriage and may be having issues in relation to that, but there is no single body that is collecting this information. And the example that we'll give in the United Kingdom is one that we encourage the government to consider, because it centralises the data collection process. And whilst that sounds clinical and cold, what we have here at the moment is anecdotal evidence of which raises huge concerns, but it is critical that we actually have data, analytical data, to back up and provide the support for changing the current system in the way in which it applies. And so that was, in my mind, a number one way in which we could strengthen the process, the regulation that relates to this, by having a central agency, whether that be the Department of Immigration, but have a central agency responsible for the collection of data. I also just would like to note that when we talked about forced marriages and we discuss the women who are victims in this so-called equation, it is very hard and difficult to flush out this information, if you like, because many of these women are very fearful of their circumstances. So you have situations where women may be brought here, they don't speak English, they've got no network of friends around them. When the husband leaves for the day, they have no one else that they can speak to. They're not aware of their rights here in Australia. They may come from countries where they fear police, so they might come here with a culture of fear of police authorities. But more importantly, they're actually unaware of their rights and they don't have anyone to speak to. And so the big issue is ensuring, and I think this is through the Immigration Department, that every woman that comes here under a sponsored marriage arrangement certainly should be apprised, and Australian authorities should be assured and comfortable with the fact that that individual is fully across what their rights are in Australia, what our protections are for individuals, the approach, the support network that is available through the refugee network, so that should they change their mind about the circumstances in which they have come here, then they feel that they generally have a network that they can turn to that would provide their support. I just also would like to support the comments that Sarah Hanson-Young made in relation to humanitarian visas. And that is something that was crying out through this inquiry, because the other problem that these women face is that not only are they not aware of their support network, but tragically they're scared. They're scared that they're the ones that are going to be returned to their country of origin, and the reason why they're particularly scared is because in many of these instances, because of the cultural practices and traditions of the countries, they will be blamed for the marriage collapsing. And with that blame comes they are ostracised. With that blame, they will be rejected by their own family. So if they are returned to their country of origin, it means that they are returning to a country where they will be penalised, whether formally or informally by their family, but they will be blamed for the collapse of this forced marriage, and they will incur the consequences of it, whatever those consequences may be. So in many of these instances, it is fair and reasonable to suggest that they will be discriminated against on return. It's not a black and white scenario where they came here to be married, the marriage didn't work, so they should be returned to the country of origin, because they will be discriminated against. There is no question that they will face prejudicial behaviour and, in many cases, rejection from their own immediate family. So there is a need for us to consider a carving off, if you like, in part of the visa framework, a humanitarian allocation for women who are in this incredibly difficult circumstance, so that consideration could be given to them to stay here with clearly strong support from various agencies, but to stay here so they're not forced to return home to what would be quite a difficult circumstance. I support this legislation. It does concerned that there may be unintended consequences from it, but I strongly support it, and I look forward to further consideration of other ways in which we can strengthen the framework to support women who may well find themselves in what could be loosely described as forced marriages. Thanks, Madam Acting Deputy President.
Senator